So for folks on the call and for folks watching the video, welcome. We are here today to reveal some research that we put together at Desegregate CT to talk about the environmental case for zoning. And we are gonna share the screen here and get our presentation up and get started in just a second. Oh, great, we've got some folks joining too. So we'll give everybody a chance here to sign in. All right, well, welcome everybody. We're gonna get the presentation up here in a second. And thanks for hopping on this afternoon. My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the inaugural director of Desegregate CT. We are a pro-homes coalition of neighbors and nonprofits who are dedicated to seeing a more sustainable and equitable Connecticut with a focus on reforming our land use policies. We are a coalition of just over 85 groups, including housing providers, community groups, anti-racism groups, local development folks, nonprofits, and increasingly, as we'll talk about today, climate groups, which we are really excited to be expanding our focus and our narrative around. Periodically, we do issue briefs like this that are primarily based on existing publicly available research, both for Connecticut and across the country. And we take it with the lens of land use reform and why, as Desegregate CT, we think environmental policy is really critical to our work. And we usually go through the lens of our zoning atlas, and we'll certainly reference that through some of our presentation today. But I'm mostly going to turn it over today to some of our legal fellows. And I just want to allow, as each person speaks, just to introduce themselves quickly and where they're going to law school. And first, I will turn it over to Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie Punzak. I'm a legal fellow with Desegregate Connecticut, and I am currently in law school at the University of Michigan. As you know, Desegregate CT is pro-homes, but we're also concerned with the environmental impact of housing and development in our state. Right now, Connecticut has largely neglected a primary cause of environmental harm, and that's its zoning laws that prevent denser development in existing residential land areas and near transit, which increases growth pressures in unsustainable areas. And that kind of development pattern is known as sprawl. This is a kind of regional pattern of real estate development that's often characterized by low density, unlimited, non-continuous outward expansion of housing and development, consumption of outer suburban and environmentally sensitive lands, and travel that's dominated by motor vehicle use. So throughout this presentation and our issue brief, we use the term zoning enforced sprawl to reflect a simple truth, and that's that our land use laws, especially those that require a minimum lot size and cap the number of units on a parcel, mandate sprawl pattern development in Connecticut. Today, 81% of the land of residential land in the state requires a minimum lot size of more than an acre or more, and that's huge. We have an issue brief about that on our website where you can learn more about the impacts of minimum lot size requirements. But as it relates to environmental impacts, it means that people are spread out across further distances, and that means they also have to use their cars, and that makes walkable neighborhoods less sustainable. If you could go back to the previous slide, the second graphic also shows that only 2% of the state's land area currently allows for multifamily development as of right. And this is a problem that we're hoping to address this legislative session through our proposal on transit-oriented communities, which you'll hear more about later on. So now you can go to the next slide. So most simply stated, sprawl creates a collection of problems for the social, environmental, and fiscal quality of our communities. And most significantly, it congests streets and highways, consumes higher levels of energy, accelerates natural resource loss across the state, and limits opportunities for the creation of affordable housing. In previous research, we've focused on how the state zoning drives up housing costs, cripples the economy, and entrenches segregation by race and class. And today we're focusing on how the environmental consequences of zoning enforced sprawl. And you can go to the next slide, where this is just a high level of the 6 environmental impacts that we're going to be focused on presenting today. That is that sprawl drives up transportation-related emissions. It contributes to the loss of forests and farmlands. It accelerates climate impacts, creates more pollution. It means our public transportation system is underutilized and increases energy consumption and costs in our state. So now I'm going to pass it off to Kobe Amos, who's going to tell you more about the first couple impacts.
Okay, so our first environmental impact of sprawl is going to be the higher transportation related emissions. And basically, as Natalie was saying, sprawl leads to car dependent communities and residents in our state. So the primary effect that that's going to have is going to increase emissions in our state. So as you can see, we have 2 cars per Connecticut household. We have a kind of lengthy work commute, and most commuters drive alone. And then also we have 38% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions actually coming from transportation. So all of these things are consequences of sprawl, and they're going to be kind of like the natural byproducts of sprawl in car dependent communities and and individuals. So if you go to the next slide, thank you. So so we have 66% of the transportation sector, the transportation sector, is a primary culprit, and responsible for 66% of our state's nitrogen oxygen oxide emissions. And that's going to be ozone emissions, and they are specifically harmful emissions. If you go to the next slide. All right, so so we see that towns that have more onerous lot size requirements, they actually have much higher emissions than towns that do not. So that kind of gives us a little bit of evidence, that kind of doing away with some of these harmful and unnecessary lot size requirements would actually drive down emissions and definitely contribute to some of our climate goals. And if you get the next slide. All right, so our second issue is going to be the loss of forest and farmlands in the state. So as you can see, throughout the time from 1985 to 2010, Connecticut actually lost a lot of forest and farmlands, and this is some of the most intense deforestation and farmland loss in the nation. And this is relevant for a few reasons. The first and probably the most significant is just going to be that forests act as carbon sinks. Forest and farmlands, they sequester and kind of hold carbon emissions in place. So without, you can stay on that slide. So without these forests, we're kind of at a much higher climate risk. So also we have 71% of Connecticut forests are privately owned, and therefore they're at a much higher risk for development. You get the next slide. So in addition, farming is a significant industry in Connecticut. So it supports 29,000 jobs. It generates 5.2 billion in the state. And then, in addition to, forest and farmland development being a significant climate risk, it also puts our food security at risk. So, we do have a significant agriculture industry in the state. And kind of, without that, we see, during, for example, during the height of the COVID pandemic, it's very difficult to kind of, get things around, and transportation of food is, can be undermined when you don't have that local, local agriculture, products. And you can go to the next slide. All right, so our third issue is basically going to be more flooding, storm water runoff, and heat islands, which are all a result of essentially more parking lots and more parking spaces being created to meet the need of sprawl. So when you have more driving and car dependent communities, you're going to have more parking lots, and usually parking lot need actually exceeds parking lot generation exceeds what is actually needed. So we have that generation exceeding the need by 30% at peak times. And you go to the next slide. So yeah, so the impervious surfaces, like pavement that don't actually absorb water, are going to lead to more frequent and more severe flooding. So that, in addition to shifts in rainfall and the increase in rainfall that we've seen in the state over the past decade, is going to lead to more frequent and then much more costly and damaging flooding. So so in addition, to just more severe flooding, rainfall that that is diverted and not absorbed directly into the ground is going to facilitate pollution. So we have just regular pollutants from things like gasoline, antifreeze, really anything that exists in large quantities on the ground is going to be carried into our waterways and is going to pollute our rivers and our streams. And so in addition to all of the the consequences that we already talked about, paved surfaces are really good at absorbing not water, obviously, but heat. So they actually hold that heat, and they can kind of re-radiate that heat. So during the summer, for example, you'll see areas that have lots of cover, so lots of tree cover and different bushes and different green areas. They will be a lot cooler than areas that primarily have pavement, so lots of parking lots, right? So this creates a real health hazard, for a lot of more densely populated areas, or areas that are more covered with parking lots and pavement. All right, so Oliver, if you want to hop in.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Oliver Morris. I'm a 2L at Quinnipiac University School of Law, and I'm going to kind of bring us home with the last three of the points here that Natalie introduced earlier. And as Kobe mentioned, sprawl increases automobile use, and of course, policies that force an increase in automobile use add to air pollution, but specifically in those areas along highways and in high congestion, traffic congestion areas. And because sprawl forces suburban residents to drive farther to reach the places where they work and they learn and they play, there's an increase in that pollution. At the same time, 71% of Connecticut's people of color and 51% of its population living in poverty dwell in just 5 cities that you can see on the slide there. And each of those cities sits either on a major transportation artery or at a place where to meet. This concentration of the poor and people of color, combined with increased automobile use, leads to disproportionate impacts on their health. According to the American Lung Association, Asian, Hispanic, and especially Black Americans are more likely to die prematurely as a result of air pollution than white Americans. In Connecticut, asthma, for example, impacts children of color at a staggeringly higher rate than white children. Those living in extreme poverty are much more likely to be subject to asthma than those with higher incomes, even though most of the driving that causes these disparities is done by white and wealthier residents who live in suburbs. Our current land use policies that encourage driving, that allow for increased auto use through these urban environments, which creates sprawl, are contributing to these unjust outcomes. And of course, we've got to work to change those. Point number 5 is a focus on our underutilized public transportation systems. As you may know, over the last 7 years, Connecticut has pumped nearly $1.2 billion into CT Fast Track and Connecticut Rail. While these two services have served millions of riders and many more millions use Metro North's New Haven line every year, our state's encouragement of sprawl reduces the impact and the value of these investments. By forcing residents to spread out across the state, sprawl makes people live farther away from public transit stations. Therefore, commuters are forced either to drive to the stations, kind of reducing the whole point of having these public transit systems, or more often, commuters simply drive straight to their destination, opting out of mass transit entirely. Further, zoning restrictions in the towns that have transit stations make it hard to build multifamily homes near them. This prices out folks who don't own cars and reduces the number of Connecticut residents who see greener, safer, more efficient mass transit as a viable transportation option because they have to live too far away to use it easily. These factors contribute to lower ridership, which causes taxpayers, who then see investments in mass transit as a waste, to discourage further improvements, which leads to a less modernized and efficient transportation fleet, which also lowers ridership, which increases citizens' discontent with mass transit, and so on in this sort of eternal loop that prevents people from using mass transit effectively. And since Connecticut has already invested significantly in mass transit, is currently expanding the Waterbury line to the tune of $1.23 million and is set to receive $1.3 billion in federal infrastructure funding, obviously, and with even much more possible via competitive grants, obviously we want to encourage use of these mass transit systems in order to get the full value of the investment that taxpayers and the state have put into them. Sprawl, unfortunately, invalidates these investments and ensures that future improvements will be discouraged, ultimately leading to increased pollution and environmental damage. And finally, our sixth point, higher energy consumption and costs. Single-family homes on large lots consume significantly more energy than homes in multifamily residences. Smaller homes with multiple families use, on average, 60% less energy than single-family homes. Suburban single-family homes generally have more rooms and have greater square footage, and thus require more energy to heat, cool, and power. Those Connecticut towns with large minimum lot sizes have much higher emission totals per capita than towns without them, nearly 20% higher, because of the significantly greater consumption of both fuel oil and electricity. This, coupled with the previously mentioned need to drive more in order to span the increasing distances to work and school, what have you, means that suburban residents living in large single-family houses on large lots contribute disproportionately to energy consumption and are major factors in the environmental impacts that follow. So those are our 6 major points. I'm going to hand it back to Pete, who will talk to you about our suggestions on how to fix some of this stuff.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Kobe and Natalie. And again, Elena has put in the chat the brief that we're referencing is on our website now, and certainly encourage folks to go through in more detail. But we really wanted to give very much the headlines about these 6 core issues related to zoning enforced sprawl. Now I'm going to talk very quickly about the path to pro-environment zoning and really what we mean by pro-homes in terms of its relationship with the natural environment. So as folks on the meeting or watching the video probably already know, one of our primary focus at the legislative session at the state level this year is around transit-oriented communities. And that's really where I want to spend the time talking today. But our goals of what a pro-environmental zoning regime looks like and why TOC is our first real stab at this, get back to what we must do in terms of our existing zoning and swapping into more of a sustainable and equitable 21st century model. And that goes back to what Natalie had talked about at the beginning of today, really those 4 core issues. And to address them, we really have to focus on getting people out of cars. We have to reduce the amount of trips that individuals take to stores, to school, et cetera. And we have to give folks the option to be able to leverage public transportation and generally just walk more in their communities to reduce the carbon emissions from car trips. That means concentrating development in existing infrastructure and corridors where there is already development. Sprawl, the logic of sprawl dictates that development will go like water to concrete to the cheapest land, which, as Kobe mentioned, can potentially be private farmland or private forests that further reduce environmental sustainability. So we must concentrate our development, our new home construction, or redevelopment where there's already things like public transportation systems, where there's already things like water and sewer. And that allows for more of our land to stay natural and reduce the kinds of runoff risks that we talked about. And finally, this does an immense amount of shrinking our individual and our household carbon footprint. As Oliver pointed out, the energy consumption costs of sprawl are considerably higher than individuals that live in walkable, dense, publicly connected communities. So all those things together are really the critical part of a pro-homes, pro-environment agenda for land use reform. And I want to get in just quickly to talk about our proposal at the state level right now around transit-oriented communities. Very simple, transit-oriented communities are a way for encouraging home construction within walking distance of a transportation station, be it a rail station or a fast track between New Britain and Hartford. A proposal that's just about to drop the bill number, and we'll get a public hearing hopefully next week on. We encourage folks to stay in touch with us about that if they're interested in testifying. But the proposal talks in context of a half-mile radius of existing transit stations. There are 62 across 40 towns and cities in the state. And within that half-mile radius, we're having a mandate of a minimum of 15 homes per acre, 10% deed restricted affordable for developments over 6 units. This feeds on our bill that we passed last year, reducing onerous parking requirements that Kobe outlined, and obviously encouraging common sense carve-outs for existing environmentally sensitive land. So even within a half-mile radius, there are wetlands, there are natural areas that, of course, we want to protect and encourage development where existing infrastructure already exists. Just jump to next slide there. What we're talking about is, I think, a really critical element here where folks that maybe have concerns about what density looks like in their communities. This is an example of 15 homes per acre. So it's a mixture of single family homes, duplexes, townhouses, smaller multifamily housing. We'll go through a couple other examples of what this could look like for towns, but really the point that we're trying to make here is twofold. One is this kind of natural density allows for the ability to meet these climate goals that we talk about. It reduces car trips, it reduces energy consumption, it reduces the destruction of our forests and farmlands, but it also does not disrupt, on the other side, where we currently live in our communities. And encouragingly, these kinds of options really do allow more kinds of housing and mixed use development to increase affordability and diversity for a number of different demographics of older folks looking to downsize, young folks looking to upsize and live closer to where they work. So this is all part of a process and within this pro-homes agenda of making the case that these kinds of policies are good for the climate. They're also good for our personal health. They're also good for our economy and good for some of the goals of desegregating our state. So if we want to slide through a couple more of these just quickly, these are other examples of different iterations what folks can make. Again, these are all just encouraging a gentle density that reduces the pressure to continue our zoning enforced sprawl and the loss of our natural spaces. So that really brings us to the end here. I wanted to remind folks again that we are in the process of going through and testifying soon on our TOC bill. We have a couple of events coming up for folks interested to learn more about TOCs. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we have a virtual workshop that we are going to go over the findings that we did of an in-person event at the Newington Junction CT Fast Track Station, going through these questions of where are environmentally sensitive lands, where are potential for home development around our public transportation systems. So we encourage folks to sign up for that. That's just been put in the chat. And just keep in mind too, that we are expecting a bill number and public hearing date, primarily hoping it's going to be early next week. So if folks are interested in testifying and supporting these kinds of policies at the state level, there is a page on our website, desegregate.ct.org// testify, which can give you more information about what we're trying to do, the arguments, including climate arguments for why we need to make this kind of action. And this is your opportunity right now to get involved and see these things pass at the state level. And I just want to also highlight too in the last slide, for folks that are interested in organizing in your local community, we have a number of assets in place for candidates that want to run for Planning and Zoning Commission to be a pro-homes candidate, for folks that are advocates that maybe don't know, they're climate activists that don't know the relationship with zoning. We have these Be the Change playbooks that can give the kind of information to seek out elected officials and make your arguments known to ensure that these kinds of pro-homes policies get passed. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left if we want to stop sharing the screen here. If folks have questions for our legal fellows, either about the report or our proposal, happy to take a few at the moment. And just, one last reminder too, that this report is up on our website now, so please feel free to go through it. This is the continuation of a series of policy briefs that we have done on the racial argument, the argument for racial integration, the argument for economic development, and now the argument for environmental urgency to make zoning reform. Any last minute questions from folks? All right, well, I want to thank all of our legal fellows for preparing this report and for speaking today. We have a lot of work to do at the state level to make a pro-homes vision the reality. And we hope that folks on the call today and watching this video will stay involved with us. We encourage, certainly number one step is to sign up for our newsletter and our mailing list, just to get informed of when events are happening near you, when there are opportunities to testify at the state level next week, and how you can get involved locally at the state level with our Pro Homes Coalition. So thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.